Hello, thanks for coming, everyone. I am very honored to introduce our artist in resident for the term. I'm Sue Sunny Park, professor of sculpture at Studio Art. All right, before we begin, I think it's very important that we acknowledge that Black Family Visual Arts Center, we're gathered today, is situated upon the ancestral and unceded land of Abenaki people. And I also want to mention that our exhibition is generous support from the Jaffe Freedy Memorial Fund and Matthew Wasaki Memorial Fund. All right, so I have a great honor to introduce our artist-in-resident, Joseph Buckley. He's born in Ellesmere Port, UK, and he received his BA from Goldsmith, University of London, MFA from Yale School of Art. All right, this is a little long-winded, but anyway. Artist is based in New York City. Buckley's work brings a formidable knowledge of science-fictional premises, trauma, catastrophe into an unformidable proximity with contemporary class and race politics. Through critical sculptural practice, I don't know if you've seen the show already, but I just want to remind you all, we will have a reception after this. He foregrounds the violence of fabrication as an analog for social reproduction of inequality, bigotry, and ecological collapse. He had many solo shows and group exhibitions, but few to mention. Solo shows include Ellesmere Engine at Ireland Gallery in New York City, Cannibal Galaxies and Specialist Galaxies in Seattle, Washington, Letter from the Home Office, Lockup International, London, UK, and Traitor Muscles at Art in General, New York City, and Brotherhood Tapestry at Tetley, Leeds, UK. And group exhibitions include Since When Did Streets Have Mouth at Bellows Grand, New York City, 50 Degrees at King's Artist Run, Melbourne, Australia, Secret Rim of Thrills and Concealment at BROWNIE Project in Shanghai, China, and Phantom Sculpture at Warwick Arts Centre in Coventry, UK, and Poor Things at Fruitmarket in Edinburgh, UK. In 2001, he received the Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship, and Buckley has taught and also currently still teaches, except for this term, at the Department of Sculpture Department at Brooklyn College, Sarah Lawrence, and also as well at Yale School of Art. In 2004, the article in Sculpture magazine by Thomas Elmer writes, Joseph Buckley hails from Leeds, UK. Since 2013, he has been developing his practice here in US. Following his inclusion in several group exhibitions, he is emerging as one of several young British artists who is expanding our understanding of sculpture practice. Buckley's compelling visual and conceptual language reference science fiction, fantasy to speak about past and present class and race politics. His sculptures operate as a speculative future phantoms of our current social reality. Preoccupied with mechanics of objectification and dehumanization, Buckley is concerned with articulation of these dynamics. He is interested in potential of sculpture as a physical thing that occupies tangible space, as well as its ability to confront and implicate viewers. And I had a very honor opportunity with Jerry this, I think winter, we drove down just to have a studio visit. And it's very impressive what Joseph's technical skill as an artist who's very analog, and you'll see that in the work as well as his kinetic and conceptual work that you will see in the exhibition. So please join us to welcoming our artist in resident, Joseph Buckley.
Hello, everybody. Everyone can hear me okay, hopefully? So, first of all, I want to thank you all for having me and to thank you for inviting me. It is very surreal to not be teaching for the first time in about 15 semesters, it feels like. And so doubly surreal to be spending that time on campus. I'm waiting for this to turn on. Oh, there we go. So I think what I would like to do, or what I'd like to spend this time doing, is kind of contextualizing how it is that I ended up making the work that's in the gallery today without speaking acutely about that work in the gallery over there. As Sunny mentioned, I am, I was born in England, though I am an American now for as long as that counts. And I came up through the British education system, came up through the British art education specifically. And I'd like to sort of, spend a little bit of time talking about and kind of flicking through a few of the works that I was making right at the beginning of the practice. I didn't expect to become an artist, though in many respects it feels kind of inevitable in hindsight. One of those times you make a decision without realizing it early on in life that affects everything that happens afterwards. In the very beginning stages of my art education, somebody incredibly close to me, my partner at the time, passed away, and everything I made after the fact for a very long time kind of revolved around my relationship to that sort of like, existential kind of pain. And without kind of like realizing it, for many, many, many years afterwards, whilst angry and upset in ways that I could barely sort of articulate, whilst actively sort of making work about it, everything I sort of touched and made kind of revolved around those kind of those great pains. I think similar and kind of in addition to that, it's worth sort of talking about the kind of the nature of the sort of like the British art education system as I experienced it versus the art education system that everybody here is kind of like familiar and immersed within, right? I was raised within, for want of a better phrase, the kind of the British Goldsmiths kind of post-conceptual sort of model. Without realizing it, I was kind of like subjected to kind of like processes and systems of like de-skilling with all of the kind of like enfeebling that sort of like implies without really sort of like realizing what was going on. Our studios at Goldsmiths were essentially offices, and we were taught to interact and relate to the sort of like workshops as if we were sort of like hiring fabricators, which for me was particularly sort of strange, having come from like a working class background and kind of having to sort of like work for my entire life, either jobs for myself or working with family members in kind of construction or adjacent sort of like industries. So I railed against that sort of like that dynamic and framework and tried to sort of like produce works that sought to reflect and fight the sort of the context which I found myself in. And I did so in ways like this, which is a work from 2012 where I took the room in which the news about my partner's passing was delivered to me. I took the room when invited back to the school to do sort of like an exhibition. I took the room and I painted the ceiling kind of gloss red whilst it was an active kind of like administrative office that sort of like people worked in. It completely changed the sort of like the vibe and the shape of the space, and it became sort of like an unpleasant sort of like room to work in for quite a while. And that was kind of like, reflective of sort of like where I was in terms of kind of general sort of, I don't know, for want of a better word, edginess at that kind of like stage in my life, and also kind of what I was kind of like interested in achieving and what became apparent that was available to me through sort of the kind of the auspices and the mechanics of kind of like installation. And so for a long time, I was making work like filling galleries with sort of like smoke from smoke machines and kind of, borrowing plimps from other people's works in order to show sort of like destroyed works, and then making works that themselves were plimps for other people's works. This is a sculpture by a pair of educators of mine, Nick Crow and Ian Rawlinson, called Slovenian Journalist. This is my contribution to that sort of like that exhibition. And so in the midst of sort of like working through, you know, all of these like dense, unreadable sort of references that kind of perhaps had like a fleeting moment of kind of legibility for British audiences, I kind of found myself in a pretty interesting sort of like situation when I sort of like moved to the United States, whereby nobody understood what I was referencing at all, because obviously people did not have the shared sort of like cultural education and the kind of the frameworks and techniques of sort of like attaining and getting hold of materials and making things happen were no longer immediately sort of like obvious and available to me. This is another good example of the kind of like annoying thing I was doing. I had a show at a gallery in Edinburgh. I insisted on having the exhibition take place in the University of Edinburgh in one of their sort of like lecture halls. The show was sort of like hung and like put on in this kind of like place, and I hired a physicist who was a member of the faculty there to show up and deliver a series of talks about heat death to like empty rooms. I say this not to sort of like boast or anything. This is kind of an example of the bad work I was making at the time. Nevertheless, I kind of moved to America, found myself frustrated with regards to kind of like trying to make work. All of this stuff like having no kind of like real kind of like connection. And then, I don't know, the kind of the racial dynamics of sort of existing in the UK versus existing in the United States kind of came into sharp focus around the time of 2014 and the murder of Mike Brown in Missouri. I was thinking about that sort of like that kind of horrific sort of like murder, which feels so long ago now. And was experimenting with just making bodies out of rags and clothes and piles of sort of like trash for the obvious kind of like illusion that kind of like brings. And whilst I was sort of like, you know, working through all of that and making all of that, I had a really sort of like interesting sort of like moment where, you know, visitors to the sculpture building and kind of, you know, janitorial staff, people who were from the same class that I was from, just transposed into a sort of like different kind of like cultural and national sort of like context. Yeah, a member of the sort of like the facility staff who I had sort of like become friendly with had a horrible moment where they stood in front of the work and kind of like screamed during the kind of like night because they thought that this pile of rags that I collected was a body. Yeah, they thought that it was actually sort of like a person who had sort of like fallen over and kind of like died or whatever. And that kind of really unlocked something in sort of like my brain with regards to kind of like the potential and the effect of like sculpture, and particularly sort of figurative sculpture. I'll flick through this quickly, but this is the kind of like the immediate body of work that kind of like came from that. I used exhausted foundry wax from kind of like a nearby bronze foundry. So wax that had been like been through the lost wax process like 10, 11, 12 times, was no longer fit for purpose, was too full of kind of like industrial runoff of like bits of kind of porcelain, of like scraps of like, you know, the wrong hardness of wax, et cetera, and cast these kind of like figures out of them. The reference I was making, because I still wasn't able, I don't know if I ever will truly be, I wasn't able to kind of like abandon sort of like this referential sort of like way of making work. The figure, the trope, the thing that I was kind of like referring to was the figure of the orc. Now, what's going on here? For real? Tut. All of these are corrupted. So I'm going to stick on the, I'm going to stick on this one here from the, I want to say the Hobbit film by Bakshi. Goblins, trolls, you know, these are sort of like cultural kind of like nodes that have long histories, you know. But the orc itself is kind of like very specifically a modern invention, specifically again by like J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien is like a really interesting sort of like figure in that, we think of him as this sort of like example and kind of like, exemplar of kind of like the bucolic sort of like British pastoral sort of like, image of England. And yet, something that isn't really sort of spoken about or that I've seen rarely sort of discussed is the fact that he was born in what became South Africa and spent many sort of years of his early sort of like life there in a place where there is and was and still is to a lesser or greater degree very rigid hierarchy within society, a sort of where the fantasy of kind of like race was turned into sort of like a set of legal sort of strictures. And also, of course, he lived within the context of the kind of like the industrial sort of like world, having served in World War I and lived in the trenches for a while. Tolkien's an interesting sort of like character as well, and in addition to that kind of like subliminal, kind of like atmospheric, ambient kind of like racism, not least because in the construction of his kind of like universe, he built languages for every single, languages and backstories and, dense histories and historiographies for every single one of the races, apart from the orcs. So, and in addition to that, one of his kind of like proposed kind of like origin points for the species of the orcs was that they were elves who were stolen from one continent by the Dark Lord, taken to a different continent, tortured into sort of like industrial servitude and rendered inevitably and inherently evil for the rest of time. We can all see the sort of like parallels with the kind of like the triangular trade there, but nevertheless, that kind of inadvertent sort of like telling upon oneself is a dynamic that I remain sort of like fascinated in to this day. So kind of this combination of kind of like the shocking potential of sort of like figurative sculpture, what it could do, the way that, it's possible to kind of trick people into thinking that they're looking at like a whole fully rendered person by only giving just a scrap of kind of like visual information. That was one thing that sort of like began at that point, as well as this interest in the kind of like, the ways that various kind of like science fictions and fantasies, the way that these kind of like ideas that form the kind of like the undergirding of so much, and if not pretty much all of our sort of like popular kind of like, fiction today, the way that these things have these kind of like inadvertent, primordial sort of like remnants of kind of like very strange like imperial sort of attitudes baked into them. In the midst of all of that, I've been making work, continuing to make work. This is I'm jumping forward a bit, but this is a body of work from the beginning of 2024. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the practice kind of like revolved around kind of a relationship to pain. And to a lesser or greater degree, one of the kind of broader projects of the practice, one of the things I've been trying to do for the last kind of 10 years, give or take, is move the ship of the practice away from kind of like these meditations upon kind of like horror and despair to try and get to a place where I'm sort of like making work about love. In the broadest kind of like possible sense. The success of that as kind of like the overarching kind of like meta project of the practice is up for debate. I'm going to go ahead and say that I've been broadly unsuccessful in that so far, as you can see from the title of this show. But here's kind of at the very least kind of like an example of kind of the work that I, the kind of the beginning of the body of work that has sort of arrived in the show, in the gallery here today. So this is a work called Floor Work 2023. It is a digitally printed vinyl banner of the type that you would normally find sort of like turned into a billboard on the side of a highway. I printed an image onto this banner that was then kind of like cut to serve as the floor for the entirety of the gallery that it was in. You can kind of like see it stretching in the opposite direction here. And the image taken from it is a 3D rendering of the space proposed within the painting, We Are Building a Better World, by the British interwar painter Paul Nash. It's a really sort of like beautiful, it's one of my favorite paintings. It's this kind of bizarre painting of literally no man's land, this kind of chewed up arboreal landscape littered with like craters and sort of like smashed and destroyed trees, with kind of like a beautiful sunrise within it. It is a very sort of, I dare say, you know, cynical image in some respects, and yet somehow still sort of like, despite itself, inspiring to look at. I was interested in sort of like freezing that kind of like moment into sort of like an eternal present, you know? The kind of like the transitory sort of like time defined by the Paul Nash painting turned into a moment that can sort of like never be escaped. So that was the floor of the entire sort of like gallery. The next work within the show was this work, which is called Extinction. These guys are about 8 feet tall, and I don't know how obvious it is, but these are kind of mishmashes of both kind of imperial kind of like architecture. You've got the portcullis, which kind of like features sort of like prominently as kind of like a symbol of kind of like of British sort of like authority. You find it on coins and so on and so forth, and on heraldry. You have these kind of like stab vests that, you know, simultaneously sort of like look like the kind of architecture you get on kind of like financial buildings, both back home in sort of like London's financial district, but also in sort of like Wall Street as well. There are elements of kind of, you know, more science fictional kind of armor styles within the context of the legs with this tubing, as well as kind of like, you know, nice pair of Doc Martens that the officer is wearing as well. And all the sort of like work kind of culminates in this, do I have an image of it? Yeah. Culminates in this kind of like this visor, which has within it cast a kind of like relief of a gray alien's face, which I'm gonna guess everybody is kind of familiar with. So, you know, this work was kind of like an attempt to collapse together, or this work comes out of like a strand within the practice of attempting to collapse together these kind of like authoritative, oppressive kind of like figures, to take, you know, a riot cop, and to kind of, you know, contemporary riot cop, and to smash him into like a British colonial officer from like Hong Kong in 1967, where many of sort of like today's like riot tactics were developed, and to smash that together with a, you know, a Roman auxiliary, you know, in the year 67 in Palestine, like, and the kind of the police, the imperial sort of like policing that the Romans were doing at that point, and then to smash it together with like a man at arms, you know, like kind of like going around sort of like the feudal demences and kind of like shaking down peasants, and to smash it together with a stormtrooper from Star Wars who's showing up on Tatooine to like shake people down and make them pay their taxes, and so on and so forth. This kind of like attempt to turn, you know, these individual sort of like instances of kind of like violence and oppression to reach back into some sort of like dysplatonic cloud, and reach out the sort of like the kind of shared mean between them all. And, you know, the work is called Extinction, you know, not simply out of kind of like a long-standing sort of like paranoia and despair, but like also, you know, the degree to which these kind of like these jobs represent a sort of a suicidal impulse in the kind of like the societies that produce them. You know, we can, I don't know, we're all familiar with images of kind of ICE agents showing up and doing awful fucking shit. And we can understand that, at least within the sort of like the purported like legal framework that we've sort of like all found ourselves inheriting, or found ourselves living within, that these things clearly don't resonate or interlock at all with what is promised on paper, right? Like in you know, they serve as a form of suicide. Within the other half of the gallery was this work Peasant, which kind of comes out of like a few sort of like different kind of dimensions. On the one hand, it was a attempt to, well, not an attempt. I think I managed to do it. It was a kind of the latest rendering at that point in time of like the series, the strand within the practice, like surrounding the orc. So here, I became particularly sort of like interested in a very sort of like bleak way, interested in sort of like, for want of a better word, like public executions, and the way that they are sort of conducted, the way that they are framed by kind of photojournalism and social media, and the kind of the sort of the implicit kind of like perhaps previously not so obvious, but now I would say increasingly obvious kind of like threat or perhaps subliminal implication that these things are potentially coming here. And so the kind of the work is two sort of like orc figures lying on a cast of the sidewalk outside of my house. You can see you got the sort of like the New York sort of standard kind of like concrete partition in the floor. A little bit of a concrete crack there from expansion. Two orcish figures lying on their sides with their arms bound with a 42-inch tabletop balanced upon them. Tabletop is poured epoxy. I don't know if you guys have ever seen like river tables or anything like that, but there's been like a really interesting sort of popularization of like epoxy resin within sort of like hobbyist and sort of like semi-professional kind of like contexts. The tabletop contains a top-down kind of NATO view of the world. I poured half of the tabletop, painted the map, and then poured the remainder of the tabletop. So the kind of like the painting is sort of suspended inside of this kind of like frozen medium. And I sort of, it's worth kind of like pointing out, I mentioned at the top, this is the first time I've not been teaching for a while, but I've also like as an artist kind of, had to support myself through other means. And one of the things I've spent a long time doing is working as like, I don't do it anymore, but like is working as like an art handler, a sort of like a fabricator and so on and so forth. And kind of ended up spending a lot of time I ended up spending a lot of time sort of like working for Herman Miller in a kind of like, in a very humble capacity as an installer, and spent a lot of time with Knoll products as well, and the tulip table in particular. Eero Saarinen's like tulip table is something that I'm still kind of like trying to work towards as kind of like a symbol within the practice that obviously wasn't sort of like rendered fully here, but is something that kind of is a pole that the work is kind of like trying to get towards, at least in this sort of context. So there is a bright red frozen image of an imperial perspective of the earth, kind of like laid upon two benighted sort of like figures. There's additional sort of like things here. The kind of like the skull shape was kind of like based somewhat off of kind of early human kind of skull shapes. The nose is simultaneously designed to look like the nose of kind of like a half decomposed corpse, but also it's supposed to kind of like reference the kind of like noses that perhaps potentially some of our primate cousins could have had. And is based explicitly on the kind of the nose of the golden snub-nosed monkey. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that before. Very much recommend everybody like researching that monkey. It's one of the best monkeys. Yeah, golden snub-nosed monkey. Yeah. I sort of, to go back to the orcs slightly, and again, my images didn't load, but one of the things that sort of like particularly interested me, and one of the things that I've sort of like developed like thinking about over the years is kind of, and I have no way to prove this. This is purely speculation. There is no potential way to sort of like ever potentially prove this. But I have a kind of like rough theory about kind of like where it is that like, you know, trolls, goblins, ogres, so on and so forth, like kind of come from. And, you know, that has perhaps a relationship to our overdeveloped sort of like capacity for like racism and xenophobia specifically, which is to say that, you know, also goes into kind of like how it is that like figurative sculpture can be so effective. We are, as animals, kind of like designed to sort of like read patterns and to like recognize other human-shaped things. Like, in addition to that, you know, all of us have kind of like a fairly sort of like well-developed relationship to, you know, the uncanny valley, which I don't think I should have to sort of like, everyone is familiar with that, I'm gonna guess. But like, why is it that we have the uncanny valley? Why is it we have this sort of like overdeveloped sort of like sense of kind of hatred of kind of like outsiders that are shaped like us that we should sort of like recognize as perhaps kin? And why is it that, you know, we're the only sort of like thinking, talking primates that like are left, you know? I have a horrible sort of like sneaking suspicion that, you know, and this is borne out to a lesser or greater degree in the sort of, in the fossil record and the, you know, the archaeological record. But yeah, my suspicion and guess is that we ate all of our sort of fellow humans, you know, our other kind of like hominid cousins. And I don't know, there's something really interesting and sort of like fascinating about that. This idea of kind of like primordial sort of like genocides, kind of like having a kind of like inherent sort of like relationship to who and what we are. It's very bleak, and I hope it's not sort of like true, but I've additionally been sort of like very interested in kind of like recent research, kind of like pointing to, you know, pitched large scale, you know, battles happening in Europe many thousands of years before people thought there were kind of like large populations there. There is a lake, I want to say Lake Tanganyika, but I may be misremembering that, in Kenya, and they dug up a mass grave from 70,000 years ago, you know. It's a bleak set of sort of like ideas, and I don't fully know exactly how to kind of like process or work through them, and indeed the work is me sort of like processing and working through it, but these are all kind of the ideas and the things that are in the practice that I'm sort of like thinking about and working through. So this show was incredibly depressing to make, and I had an awful time installing it. I'll say nothing more about that. So I have, as mentioned, been trying to sort of turn the ship of the practice, this large lumbering sort of like thunderstorm or boat, towards kind of like things that are less sort of like horrifying, you know, inherently. And so I made this work. It's called oh, come on, where'd you go? It's called Family in the Earth. And I'll flick through the images. And this is an honest to God attempt to try and make, as I said, more hopeful sort of like work. It's based off of a, I don't know, the name is escaping me right now, but I'm sure we're all familiar with the kind of like for want of a better word, the genre of kind of like archaeological dig sites whereby, you know, families or kind of like lovers are found kind of like intertwined with each other, buried together. I'm sure we've all sort of like seen images from Pompeii or perhaps visited Pompeii. Kind of, you know, a follow-on from the sort of the peasant work from the Despair Engine show. I was kind of like interested in sort of like exploring that kind of like dynamic further. And so what this is a reclaimed institutional notice board that I got from Materials for the Arts, I want to say. And it existed in an institutional sort of like context. Maybe it was in a police station, maybe it was in like a high school, maybe it was in all manner, you know, maybe it was in the DSNY. And I turned it into the top of these kind of like these bases that I've been making for a while. And then, you know, for the first time sort of like excavated into the kind of, into the sort of like the body of the shape of the base. And the form as mentioned, kind of like has those kind of like, those kind of like antecedents in history and in kind of like archaeology, but also is, the work is kind of like, was an opportunity to really play with scale in kind of like a bizarre way that I hadn't necessarily had the opportunity to do before. So the central sort of like figure here is, or the central pair of figures are a kind of cheap photogrammatic scan of my wife and son whilst they were sleeping one day. I printed that out, and then I kind of placed it within a sort of box. And then the sides of the pit that they are found within, I gouged those out of clay with my hands and then blew them back up to sort of like life size. And then, you've got these sort of like finer detail scans from previous sort of like works. There's elements of actual sculpting in there. And then the hands of the child figure are rendered from kind of like primitives within the kind of like the digital modeling program that I use. And that may sound like a strange sort of like phrase, but anybody here who's like worked in any sort of like digital modeling sort of like context will know what primitives means. It kind of refers to just sort of the simplest shapes that we build things out of, which itself is kind of like an interesting sort of like thing. I want to say that, as kind of like mentioned earlier with regards to kind of like doing, as a much younger man, kind of like these works that were about kind of, for want of a better word, trying to kind of like humiliate back the institution by like painting ceilings or adding these kind of like obnoxious sort of like obstructions to like people's kind of like normal kind of like working relationships with spaces. I used to think that was born out of like a relationship to sort of like fearlessness. And I realize now, kind of like many years later, having a son, that having a child, that it wasn't actually sort of like fearlessness that was kind of like guiding me. Instead, kind of like, nihilism and sort of like despair. And I don't know how relevant this is to anybody in the room other than kind of like fellow educators, but the introduction of fear that kind of like having a child sort of like has radically sort of like changed the practice in kind of like ways that I never sort of like anticipated. I never knew what fear truly was until there was somebody in my life that was more important than the practice, and I'd like to say that's made me a better artist, but who can say? Finally, there is this work here, which I think is maybe a little bit more successful in regards to my attempt to get towards like making works about love as opposed to horror. This work is called Walking Angel. It's about this big. So the eye is kind of much larger than real life. And yeah, it was an attempt to sort of render an angel out of pain, I guess. But to try and sort of, I realize I'm saying that now, but like, and I'm contradicting the thing I was saying about love, but, trying to sort of like render this sort of constructive relationship out of perhaps pain, to try and render some sort of like, some sort of relationship to love out of despair. And I guess broadly speaking, I think I was wrong when I was kind of like thinking this, but I spent, 2003 to, I guess, recently, trying to sort of like mine despair, and, I'm sure everybody in this room, as people who live on Earth in the year 2025, seeing all manner of like horrifying things on our phones and TV screens and all the notifications and pop-ups that we get that, tell us to worry, rightfully so. I was trying and attempting to sort of like mine despair, to sort of like use it as some sort of like constructive tissue to sort of like build, if not hopeful things out of, then at least sort of like ways of thinking that had like utility for, myself or perhaps other people. Again, perhaps futile, but, this is the work made immediately before beginning on the body of work that is in 0102 next door. I hope that that gives some context to sort of like where I'm coming from and where I'm at. I think that, like, you know, broadly speaking, I think a lot about something that like John Baldessari said about how sometimes he would look at his work and feel like he was doing kind of like all the same thing, like for decades, that every work was just sort of like a copy of the work before and that he'd never innovated at all. And then, you know, he says, and then the next day I look at my sort of like portfolio, I look at all of my work and I get worried that there's no sort of like through line between any of it. I don't know, I've resonated with that a lot over the years. And similarly, you know, this is only a tiny sort of like slice of all the works that I've sort of like made. And yeah, I could probably present a very different sort of like face by just showing different stuff. But nevertheless, yeah, thank you for listening to me. Thanks.
I have a mic if anybody has a question.
And I'm happy to talk about kind of the, you know, some of the more technical aspects or anything. I'll answer any question except what my social security number is.
Hi.
Hi.
I noticed that in both of your sculptures that have like visible feet, they seem to be like much more detailed than the rest of the body. Like, do you have a connection with sort of the like the imagery of feet as opposed to, you know, you talking about your son having the like primitive sculptured hands?
You know, that's an it's an interesting sort of like question to ask. I would sort of like counter that, like, yes, I am sort of like particularly sort of like interested in kind of like, you know, the kind of the vague sort of like truism that was sort of like passed around my family by like aunties and my mother over the years, that like pain is like stored in the feet, that there is like, you know, this idea of sort of like trauma being passed down through sort of like generations and it being obvious and apparent in the sort of like feet. Added to that, you know, they're the sort of the one of the body parts that sort of like can get the most fucked up from just sort of like living, you know, like I think often about sort of like arthritis and kind of the ways that, like, you know, we are slightly not designed to sort of like walk, you know, like the way that we all obviously are designed to do because of the ways that sort of like, you know, various arthritises and diseases and so on and so forth kind of like, you know, foster, you know. I really love like sculpting hands and feet because probably it's quite difficult. And, you know, I'll admit that not all of the hands and feet that I've sculpted over the years have been very good. But nevertheless, like there's something about kind of like the attempt. There's something about kind of like working through it that, you know, holds incredible sort of like potential, I find, within my sort of like practice. And I think I'll say something, you know, that is a little bit of kind of like a somersault away from the question, but that hopefully answers it in sort of like a broader sense, which is to say that, like, it's difficult to, it feels strange to sort of like talk about kind of like my practice, you know, and give an overview of my practice at this point, because I feel like it's going through like a huge amount of sort of like change, which is to say that everything I showed you, like everything, you know, here, like represent like a relationship to the sort of like work where I was kind of like testing things out, where every sort of, you know, I couldn't materially afford to buy, you know, crystal clear 204 in order to sort of like test out an idea, you know, and do a couple of tests before I made the final thing, because of the prohibitive sort of like expense of many of the materials that I'm invested and interested in working with. And so for a long time, kind of like every single work was a test. And now I've kind of like reached the point where I feel like I know how everything sort of like works. And to a lesser or greater degree, that is from hard-won experience as an artist myself. But it's also from like having to work as like a fabricator, having to work as an artist assistant, having to work as an art handler, having had to have made like museum quality works for other people for a decade, you know? And it comes from sort of like teaching and having to sort of like know how the materials sort of like really fundamentally sort of like work in a really intrinsic way to be able to like answer any question about them. And so, you know, that show in there is the first time I feel like, you know, it feels like the first body of like mature work in one respect. It's the first time where everything hasn't been a blag, you know, everything hasn't been sort of like a wish and a prayer, you know, like, so yeah, that's my answer to your question about feet. I hope it's okay.
Hi, thank you for sharing. I noticed like at the start you mentioned a lot of your work was rooted in loss, but loss, and you also mentioned fantasy and like how the orcs like had like I've read The Lord of the Rings. I did not notice that the orcs didn't have like a backstory. So I guess I have like kind of like a kind of like a mixed question. One is like you said like you want to like find like a new like a more positive light in your art. Would you ever reconsider like going back to something like some of your darker work and like finding like a new meaning in that? Like for example, like the orcs are like the darkest part of like the Lord of the Rings. Like would you ever like explore fantasy and combine that with some sort of like reality? Like
I'll answer what feels like the first half of the question first, which is to say that like I felt a great degree of sort of like agency within my own practice, and as an artist, when I realized that like all of the artists that like I really admired, and that all of the artists that at a particular point in my life I was really sort of like in love with, were essentially sort of like redigesting and reformulating and reproducing sort of like ideas over time in various kind of like artworks, and in remaking the work when you get better at it, like, you know, evolving and sort of like developing the practice, developing one's relationship to the ideas. You know, if you return to an idea to sort of like work with it, as I have with like orcs, you know, the first time I made orcs, they were shallow and naive compared to, I'd like to think, what is at play conceptually and visually and technically with, you know, the most recent sort of like iteration of the orcs that I kind of like made in the context of the family in the earth. With regards to sort of like returning to fantasy, I think broadly speaking, in the broadest sense, I am deeply suspicious of kind of like fantasy. I'm deeply suspicious of sort of like science fiction. And I maintain that kind of like, you know, relationship to it as a kind of like huge fan. You know what I mean? Like, I think that we, you know, we live, as we all know, in a deeply incredibly like hostile, sort of like anti-intellectual sort of like culture and society, right? Like even ensconced within the sort of like bubble of academia as we are, we all know like the contempt that sort of like many people have in positions of power towards the very idea of sort of like thinking critically, you know? And so I don't know, I feel like I would potentially be sort of like, it is, you know, the interest specifically in the Lord of the Rings, you know, and, you know, you have to dig a little bit into perhaps some of the, you know, the letters to other authors and to like his son, you know, Tolkien's letters I'm speaking about particularly. That's where a lot of the sort of like background stuff comes from, and a lot of his kind of like anxiety, for want of a better word, and kind of like unsureness about the sort of like the sort of like history of orcs is. You know, he says in various letters that, you know, the orcs, you know, Sauron is Hitler, Sauron is Stalin, but also like he'll say, no, it's not Sauron, it's not Stalin. These are like, you know, reductionist sort of like readings. He'll say, you know, I've never sort of like viewed the orcs as a particular sort of like racialized group of people, or I've never saw them as like a particular group of sort of like, you know, a particular segment of society. And then in another letter, he'll sort of like say, oh, I hate these communists, like they're all orcs. Do you know what I mean? So like, I guess what I'm sort of saying is like, you know, and this is no real sort of like slur on kind of like Tolkien. He's a man of his time. Lovecraft is a man of his time. Philip K. Dick is a man of his time. Notice I'm focusing on the men here. Like the sort of the degrees to which these people kind of like implicate themselves, you know, the degrees to which these people sort of like betray the positions that they perhaps aren't even consciously aware of, that's something that deeply fascinates me. And so it would be a mistake of me to sort of like, you know, go back and try and sort of like, you know, reinscribe some sort of like more hopeful message into the material of the Lord of the Rings, because there isn't one. Do you know what I mean? And that's good. That's interesting. Do you know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, the world of the Lord of the Rings is a fantasy wherein like the fiction of race is true, you know? Like, and we all know that whilst it's true and it's something that exists, it's really more like a scam. Do you know what I mean? Like a scam is real, but like it's not real. You know what I mean? And so that's the dynamic that I'm sort of like interested in. And I'll stop there so I don't talk about it for the next 5 hours.
In like making work from tragedy, my question is, how do you feel that your relationships to those works changed as you began to like maybe grow and develop as a person, and your relationship to that tragedy might have changed?
I think that, I, despite being an art educator, like despite like teaching people how to make things, like there really is like, nothing else I could do, nothing else that I really want to do, nothing else that I feel like I could meaningfully sort of like produce or do. I think I would be unhappy to the point of non-existence, were I to be sort of like removed from the capacity or the ability to sort of like produce work. I don't think I could like go blind, for instance. I like art because I like people, I like, and I like, I guess I'll answer it like this. I remember sort of like being like a teenager and sort of like miserable. I must have been like 19 or maybe 20, 21, like living in London for the first time at Goldsmiths, feeling, more alienated than, I thought at the time it was possible to feel. This was pre the pandemic, of course. And I remember just sort of like walking around sort of like an Edvard Munch exhibition at like Tate Modern. And, Munch being an artist who has nothing to do with me. Do you know what I mean? Like almost no sort of like parallels. We share no language. We have no sort of like cultural cognates, barely, like in common with each other. There's nothing there, right? And yet I remember sort of like walking around that sort of like exhibition and feeling a sort of like a moment of kind of like resonance, of like sort of like looking at these kind of like, these paintings of kind of like, of his sister dying, and sort of like feeling deep recognition despite like a vast gulf in time. And I felt that sort of like feeling in other places like museums. Do you know what I mean? Like I remember walking around like the Met in New York City, seeing a sculpture of the god Bess, like in a little sort of like jug, and being like, wow, humans have been like sculpting weird little guys for like thousands of years. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's one of the main things that we do, like actually. And there's obviously something like heartening in sort of like realizing that you are part of something bigger, in understanding and realizing that like despite the sort of like the fallibilities of our body, despite the shortness of our lifespans, and despite the cruelty and the tragedy that defines like, most of the societies that we live in, whether we benefit from those systems of cruelty or not, other people are making stuff and we're making stuff too, and that's nice, like. And in a sort of like more acute, like personal sense, I don't know if I would be alive right now if I hadn't been able to sort of like develop a practice, like I'm sort of really interested in kind of like people who have relationships to sort of like systems of magic, like people who sort of like practice like magical sort of like systems, or people who join magical organizations. And one of the things, I like reading about that stuff. I like sort of like looking into it, and I like reading about it, like, and one of the things that sort of like I always kind of like walk away with thinking about is the degree to which like so many of us, like as artists, are kind of like doing something very similar for ourselves, for our own sort of like practice. Everyone is kind of like creating like a system of sort of like control and negotiation with themselves, with everyone else, and with the world at large. And I think that, in a world, again, in a hostile sort of like world that doesn't respect like thinking, that doesn't respect sort of like creativity, that fundamentally sort of like is hostile to so many of the things that very obviously we care about, I don't need to sort of like tell you guys, but like a very sort of like easy example is the fact that, is fucking the existence of AI as like an industry. Like, in the midst of all of that, I started thinking about AI and got angry, and I lost my point. Sorry. Like, fuck, what was I saying? I thought about like Sam Altman's face like flashed into my brain, and I saw red. I I'm sorry. Sorry if there's anyone who's like really into AI here, but you're wrong. No. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess what I was sort of like, I guess trying to say is that, like, you know, having, you know, we live in a world that sort of like asks us not to do things, that asks us to alienate ourselves from like making stuff and from labor and so on and so forth. And I think that, you know, being able to make things like is a way that I understand myself. It's a huge part of my identity. It's a huge part of who I am. The ability to sort of like walk into a gallery or anywhere and sort of like look at something and to tell you how it's made very confidently and to be right, to tell you, you know, we could go into a gallery now and anybody who's like been doing this for long enough could tell anybody how any work is sort of like made and probably the steps that were taken to sort of like make it. That relationship to fabrication, to labor, to production is something that I find particularly sort of like inspiring, especially in a world that sort of like works to strip us of our agency in that sort of like most fundamental aspect. So again, being able to make stuff, you know, being able to sort of like produce something from, if not nothing, then at the very least trash, you know, is kind of like, is really sort of like powerful and something that like kind of like keeps me invested in the sort of like the practice and so on and so forth.
Hi, thanks for your time. So my question, and you kind of touched on this earlier, is, you know, in recent years, there's been, as consumers, we've kind of turned more towards escapist, you know, as opposed to like the news. We've been, and maybe it's due to, you know, fatigue with all of the violence that's happening in the world and everything that's going on, or maybe it's from insidious advertising. But, you know, there has been more of a towards escapism and the way that we consume media to be, you know, we want to feel more hopeful. We want to kind of feel happier. Do you think that that's influenced, you know, the meaning of your work or even just the visual aspects of your work at all?
I mean, I don't know if I necessarily sort of like, I understand what you're saying and can definitely sort of like resonate with the kind of like the vague, you know, the sort of like the vibe that you're sort of like gesturing towards. However, like I think that there's, you know, I wonder the degree to which that necessarily holds true in that there's kind of always been sort of like fantasy. Do you know what I mean? There's always been sort of like relationships to stories and ideas that like can't exist or don't exist. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's many fun, interesting arguments over like when the first sci-fi novel was. You know, is it like H.G. Wells? Is it like, you know, is it, you know, Mary Shelley? Is it like, is it Thomas? You know, is it Thomas More's like Utopia? Is it like, you know, is it, you know, that story about like the princess going to heaven, going to the moon? You know, like from China. You know what I mean? Like there's all sorts of like arguments and sort of like, you know, compelling ideas around sort of like when this relationship to fantasy and science fiction began in the first place. So I don't know if I necessarily sort of like would agree that that's something that we're doing more or less now, though I definitely sort of agree that perhaps the reasons that we get into it are because of the things that you're sort of like highlighting. I think, what was the other part of the question? It was like,
It was more on like positivity, hopefulness, like leaning towards that more as like an escape from maybe what's happening or that we're being exposed to it so much.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily know how to sort of like answer that, but I think what I will kind of like point to instead is maybe sort of like thinking about kind of like how work gets read and understood like after the fact, and sort of like how it is that we navigate and think through that. And again, I don't have any sort of like concrete sort of like answers about that, but it is certainly something that I like think about, right? To go back to the anecdote about sort of like seeing the Monk show, like he could never have sort of like imagined that the show would be like, you know, in a diesel factory, you know, in a former diesel factory, like, you know, 100 meters off of the ground. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can't sort of like, I can't really anticipate how the work will sort of like be understood in the future, or indeed whether there will be a future at all, right? Like, because all of this is only because of people, right? You know, if there's no people left, there is no history, there is no anything, you know, like, and so, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll sort of answer that by sort of like pointing to, I guess, how I understand myself within sort of, you know, when I get sort of like silly enough to think about my relationship to sort of like broader timescales. It's one of the main reasons I'm interested in working with like plastic, you know. It's one of the main, you know, we live in a petrochemical sort of like world, you know. We can go to Home Depot and buy wood, and, you know, the wood that we buy, the plywood itself is, you know, by weight, a significant proportion resin. Do you know what I mean? Because of the glue that they use to stick it together. You know, like petroleum is like in literally everything surrounding us, not just in the sort of like objects, but like in our bones, in our teeth, in our hair. Like, and I think it's despair-inducing, but it's also sort of like really fascinating as well. It's something that like really interests me, and I don't know how I couldn't. You know, and maybe this is more of a reflection of the kind of weirdo that I am. I don't know how I couldn't sort of like try and tackle that in the work, you know? Like, so that's something that will sort of like be potentially thought about if anybody is left to sort of like look at the work in any stretch of time in the future. I sort of had a work collected by the Arts Council collection in England, which is like kind of like a national collection, one of the national collections for the UK. And when they asked for like maintenance instructions for the artwork on like how to store it, how to care for it, how to reassemble it, and how to make sure to fix anything if I wasn't around anymore. And that is, you know, strange in and of itself to think about kind of like someone fixing a work when you're not there. But one of the things that they explicitly like asked for when asking for these instructions was to make sure I was using language that would be understood 2 centuries from now. Like, you know, so I guess if the institutions that we're sort of like working with and working around and thinking about and inhabiting are thinking in centuries, even if our political systems necessarily aren't, like it's, I don't know, it behooves us to a lesser or greater degree to at least indulge some of that thinking, even if it might sort of like be cringe-inducing or strange to consider, you know? Like, I hope that we might all be so lucky to have somebody millennia from now look at a shard of a thing that we made and go, oh, there was someone else like me once upon a time, you know? I'm not so lonely. Like, I don't know, that's something I kind of like hold on to.
Terrific. Now, if we exit through that door, you can go see Joseph's exhibition, have some food, some drink, and continue the conversation. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.